Welcome back. I am Pemberton, and this is Book 14, Part 5, The Close of the Book, and the Making of a King. Herod, a hunted fugitive, makes a reckless dash across a stormy winter Mediterranean to Rome itself, and there, in one of the great reversals of this history, Antony and Octavian and the Senate proclaim him King of the Jews, a kingdom he does not actually hold a foot of. We will follow the long, hard war to make the title real, his landing, his campaigns up and down the country against Antigonus, the relief of his besieged family, and at last the great joint siege of Jerusalem with the Roman general Sosius, the bloody capture of the city, Herod desperately restraining his Roman allies from sacking the temple, and the end of the Hasmonean Antigonus. And through it all, the marriage that ties this Idumean to the old royal line Mariamne. Let us finish Book 14.
Herod was not broken by the terrible troubles he was facing. Instead, they made him quicker to recognize bold and unexpected courses of action. He went to Malchus, king of Arabia, whom he had once treated with great kindness, hoping now to receive some return for those favors when he needed help more than ever. He asked Malchus to give him money, either as a loan or as a gift, in view of the many benefits Malchus had received from him. Herod did not yet know what had happened to his brother, and he was eager to ransom him from his enemies. He was ready to pay 300 talents for his release. For that purpose he also brought with him the son of Phasaelus, a child only 7 years old, intending that the boy should serve as a hostage for repayment of the money. But messengers from Malchus came out to meet Herod, and told him to leave, saying that the Parthians had ordered Malchus not to receive him. This was only an excuse, used so that Malchus would not have to repay what he owed. The leading men among the Arabians also pushed him toward this course, because they wanted to cheat Herod out of the sums they had received from Antipater, and that Antipater had entrusted to their honesty. Herod answered that he had not come to trouble them by his visit. He only wanted to speak with them about certain matters of the greatest importance to him. After this, Herod decided to leave, and he wisely took the road toward Egypt. During the journey he stayed in a certain temple, where he had left many of his followers. The next day he came to Rhinocolora, and there he learned what had happened to his brother. Malchus soon regretted what he had done and hurried after Herod, but it was useless, because Herod had already gone a very long distance and was hastening along the road to Pelusium. When the ships stationed there prevented him from sailing to Alexandria, he appealed to their captains. Because they held him in great respect and esteem, they helped him and brought him into the city of Alexandria. Cleopatra tried to keep him there, but she could not persuade him to stay, because he was hurrying to Rome, even though the weather was stormy, and he had been told that affairs in Italy were in great confusion and disorder. So Herod sailed from there toward Pamphylia. He was caught in a violent storm and barely managed to escape to Rhodes, losing the ship's cargo. The two of his friends Sapinus and Ptolemaeus met him. He found that the city had been badly damaged in the war against Cassius. Although he himself was in need, he did not neglect the city, but did all he could to help restore it to its former condition. He also built a 3-decked ship there, and from Rhodes he sailed with his friends for Italy. He came to the port of Brundusium, and from there went on to Rome. When Herod reached Rome, he first told Antony everything that had happened to him in Judea, how his brother Phasaelus had been seized by the Parthians and put to death by them, how Hyrcanus was being held captive by them, how they had made Antigonus king after he promised them no less than 1,000 talents and 500 women from the chief families and of Jewish birth, how Herod had carried the women away by night, how he had escaped from his enemies after enduring many hardships, how his own relatives were in danger of being besieged and captured, and how he had sailed through a storm and disregarded all those terrible dangers in order to come as quickly as possible to Antony, who was at that time his hope and his only help. This account made Antony pity the change in Herod's condition. Antony considered that such reversals commonly happen to men who hold great rank, since they are exposed to the changes of fortune. He was very ready to give Herod the help he asked for, partly because he remembered his friendship with Antipater, partly because Herod offered him money to make him king just as he had earlier given money to be made tetrarch, and especially because Antony hated Antigonus, whom he regarded as a seditious man and an enemy of the Romans. Caesar was also eager to advance Herod's dignity and assist him in what he wanted, because of the hardships of war that he himself had shared with Herod's father Antipater in Egypt, because of the hospitality Antipater had shown him, because of the kindness Antipater had always displayed, and also to please Antony, who was very zealous on Herod's behalf. A meeting of the Senate was therefore called. Messala first, and then Atratinus, introduced Herod to the Senate. They spoke at length about the benefits they had received from his father, and reminded the senators of the goodwill he had shown toward the Romans. At the same time they accused Antigonus, and declared him an enemy, not only because he had opposed the Romans before, but also because he had now ignored them, and received his government from the Parthians. This angered the Senate. Antony added that it would be to their advantage in the Parthian war for Herod to be king. All the senators approved this, and they issued a decree accordingly. This was the chief proof of Antony's affection for Herod. He not only obtained a kingdom for him that Herod had not expected, but obtained it with remarkable speed. Herod had not come intending to ask for the kingdom for himself, because he did not suppose the Romans would grant it to him, since they were accustomed to give such authority to someone from the royal family. Instead, he had meant to ask it for his wife's brother, who was the grandson of Aristobulus through his father and of Hyrcanus through his mother. Yet Antony secured the kingdom for Herod himself so suddenly that Herod received what he had not expected, and left Italy after only 7 days in all. Herod later arranged for that young man, the grandson, to be killed, as will be shown in the proper place. When the Senate was dismissed, Antony and Caesar came out of the Senate house with Herod between them, while the consuls and the other magistrates went before them, so that they might offer sacrifices and deposit their decrees in the Capitol. Antony also gave Herod a feast on the first day of his reign. In this way Herod received the kingdom, obtaining it in the 184th Olympiad, when Caius Domitius Calvinus was consul for the second time and Caius Asinius Pollio for the first time. During all this time Antigonus was besieging those who were in Masada. They had plenty of every other necessity, but lacked water. Because of this, Joseph, Herod's brother, was planning to escape from the place with 200 of his dependents and go to the Arabians, for he had heard that Malchus regretted the wrongs he had committed against Herod. But God prevented his departure by sending rain in the night, which filled their cisterns. Joseph therefore had no need to flee for that reason. The people in Masada now took courage, especially because the abundant water that had come when they needed it seemed to them a sign of divine providence. They made a sally and fought hand to hand with Antigonus's soldiers, some openly and some secretly, and killed many of them. At the same time VCTK, the Roman general, was sent out of Syria to drive the Parthians from it. He followed them into Judea, pretending that he had come to help Joseph, but in truth the whole affair was only a trick to get money from Antigonus. The Romans camped very near Jerusalem, stripped Antigonus of a large sum of money, and then VCTK withdrew with most of the army. But so that his wrongdoing would not be discovered, he left Silo there with a certain part of his soldiers. Antigonus cultivated friendly relations with Silo so that Silo would cause him no trouble, while he still hoped that the Parthians would return and defend him. By this time Herod had sailed from Italy to Ptolemais. He gathered a sizable army, made up both of foreigners and men of his own country, and marched through Galilee against Antigonus. Silo and VCTK also came to help him, after Delius, whom Antony had sent to support Herod's restoration, persuaded them to do so. VCTK was busy settling the disturbances the Parthians had caused in the cities. Silo was in Judea, but Antigonus had bribed him. Even so, as Herod advanced, his army grew larger every day, and almost all Galilee joined him. His next concern was the people in Masada, because his relatives were shut up there under siege, and he was bound to try to save them. But Joppa stood in his way. He had to take that city first, since it was hostile to him, so that when he went on to Jerusalem he would not leave a stronghold in enemy hands behind him. Silo used this as a pretext to leave Jerusalem, and the Jews pursued him. Herod then attacked them with a small force, routed them, and rescued Silo, who was hardly able to defend himself. After Herod took Joppa, he hurried to free his family in Masada. Some of the people of the country joined him because of their friendship with his father. Some joined because of the impressive position and display he now had. Others joined to repay benefits they had received from both father and son. But the largest number came because they hoped to gain something from him later, if he became firmly established as king. Herod now had a strong army. As he marched, Antigonus set traps and ambushes in the passes and in the places best suited for them, but in fact he did little or no harm to Herod's forces. Herod received his family from Masada, took the fortress Ressa, and then went on toward Jerusalem. The soldiers who were with Silo accompanied him the whole way, as did many citizens who feared his power. As soon as Herod pitched his camp on the west side of the city, the guards posted in that part of Jerusalem shot arrows and threw darts at him. Some of them also rushed out in a crowd and came to fight hand to hand with the front ranks of Herod's army. Herod ordered that a proclamation first be made around the wall. He had come for the good of the people and for the preservation of the city. He was not coming to keep an old grudge even against his most open enemies, but was ready to forget the offenses committed against him by his greatest opponents. Antigonus answered Herod's proclamation in the presence of the Romans and of Silo. He said it would not be just for them to give the kingdom to Herod, who was only a private man and an Idumean, that is, a half-Jew. According to their custom, they ought to give it to someone from the royal family. Even if they now hated Antigonus and had decided to strip him of the kingdom because he had received it from the Parthians, there were still many others in his family who, by their law, could receive it, and who had done nothing at all to offend the Romans. Since they belonged to the priestly family, it would be disgraceful to pass them over. While both sides spoke this way to each other and fell into mutual reproaches, Antigonus allowed the men on his wall to defend themselves. They used their bows with great eagerness against their enemies, and easily drove Herod's men away from the towers. It was now that Silo showed plainly that he had accepted bribes. He had many of his soldiers complain loudly that they lacked provisions, demand money to buy food, and say that they ought to be allowed to go into suitable winter quarters, since the places near the city had become a desert because Antigonus's soldiers had carried everything away. In this way he set the army in motion and tried to march off. But Herod urged Silo not to leave, and he appealed to Silo's captains and soldiers not to abandon him, since Caesar, Antony, and the Senate had sent him there. He promised that he would provide them with plenty of everything they lacked and easily obtain a great abundance of what they needed. After making this request, he immediately went out into the country and left Silo no excuse at all for leaving. He brought in an unexpected quantity of provisions and sent word to his friends living around Samaria to bring grain, wine, oil, cattle, and every other kind of supply down to Jericho, so that the soldiers would have no shortage in the future. Antigonus understood what Herod was doing and at once sent men through the country to stop and ambush those who went out for provisions. These men obeyed Antigonus's orders, gathered a large number of armed men around Jericho, settled on the mountains, and watched for those who brought the supplies. Herod, however, was not idle. He took 10 companies of soldiers, 5 Roman and 5 Jewish, along with some mercenaries and a few horsemen, and came to Jericho. They found the city deserted, except that 500 people had taken refuge on the hilltops with their wives and children. Herod captured these and sent them away. The Romans then fell on the city, plundered it, and found the houses full of every kind of valuable goods. The king left a garrison at Jericho, returned, and sent the Roman army into winter quarters in the regions that had come over to him, Judea, Galilee, and Samaria. Through the bribes he had given Silo, Antigonus gained this much. Part of the army was quartered at Lydda, in order to please Antony. So the Romans laid aside their weapons and lived in abundance. Herod was not content to remain still. He sent his brother Joseph against Mariamne with 2,000 armed foot soldiers and 400 horsemen, while he himself came to Samaria. There he left his mother and his other relatives, who had already come out of Masada, and then went into Galilee to capture certain places held by Antigonus's garrisons. He advanced to Sepphoris while God sent snow, and Antigonus's garrisons withdrew, leaving Herod with a great supply of provisions. From there he moved on and decided to destroy the robbers who lived in the caves and caused great harm in the country. He sent against them a troop of horsemen and 3 companies of armed foot soldiers. They were very near a village called Arbela. 40 days later, Herod himself came with his whole army. When the enemy boldly rushed out against him, the left wing of his army gave way. But Herod appeared with a body of men, put those who were already winning to flight, and recalled his own men who were running away. He then pressed hard on his enemies and pursued them as far as the river Jordan, though they fled by different roads. In this way he brought all Galilee over to his side, except for the people who lived in the caves. He distributed money to each of his soldiers, giving them 150 drachmae apiece and much more to their captains, and sent them into winter quarters. At that time Silo came to Herod with his commanders, because Antigonus would no longer give them provisions. Antigonus had supplied them for only 1 month. More than that, he had sent word to the whole surrounding country and ordered the people to carry away the provisions there and withdraw into the mountains, so that the Romans would have nothing to live on and would die of famine. Herod entrusted this matter to Phaerus, his youngest brother, and also ordered him to repair Alexandrium. Phaerus quickly supplied the soldiers with great plenty and rebuilt Alexandrium, which had previously lain deserted. Around this same time Antony stayed for a while at Athens. Then Titius, who was now in Syria, sent for Silo and commanded him first to help Herod finish the present war, and then to send for their allies for the war in which the Romans themselves were engaged. Herod, meanwhile, hurried against the robbers in the caves and sent Silo away to Titius while he marched on them. These caves were in mountains that were extremely steep. In the middle of the mountains there were sheer precipices, with entrances into the caves, and the caves were surrounded by sharp rocks. In them the robbers lay hidden, together with their families. To destroy them, the king had certain chests made and bound with iron chains, so they could be lowered by a machine from the top of the mountain. It was impossible to climb up to the caves because of the steep ascent, and it was also impossible to creep down to them from above. These chests were filled with armed men who held long hooks in their hands, so that they could drag out anyone who resisted, throw them down, and kill them in that way. But lowering the chests was extremely dangerous because of the vast depth, even though the men had provisions inside the chests with them. When the chests were lowered, none of the people at the cave mouths dared come near them, but stayed still out of fear. Some of the armed men then put on their armor, seized with both hands the chain by which the chests had been lowered, and went into the mouths of the caves, because they were angry at the delay caused by the robbers' refusal to come out. When they reached any of the entrances, they first killed many of those at the mouths of the caves with their darts. Then they dragged toward themselves with hooks those who resisted, and threw them down the precipices. After that they entered the caves and killed many more, then returned to their chests and remained there. Terror seized the rest when they heard the lamentations, and they gave up hope of escaping. When night came, the whole work stopped. The king then proclaimed by a herald that anyone who surrendered to him would receive pardon, and many accepted the offer. The same method of attack was used the next day. Herod's men went farther, came out in baskets to fight the robbers, fought them at their doors, and sent fire in among them, setting their caves ablaze, because there was a great deal of combustible material inside. One old man was trapped in one of these caves with 7 children and a wife. They begged him to let them go out and surrender to the enemy. But he stood at the cave mouth and killed each of his children as each one went out, until he had destroyed them all. After that he killed his wife, threw their bodies down the precipice, and then threw himself after them. In this way he chose death rather than slavery. Before he did this, he bitterly reproached Herod for the low origin of his family, even though Herod was then king. Herod saw what he was doing, stretched out his hand, and offered him every possible assurance for his life. By these means all the caves were finally brought completely under control. After the king appointed Ptolemy as his general over those parts of the country, he went to Samaria with 600 horsemen and 3,000 armed foot soldiers, intending to fight Antigonus. But Ptolemy did not succeed in command of the army. The same men who had already caused trouble in Galilee attacked him and killed him. Afterward they fled into the lakes and into places that were almost impossible to reach, destroying and plundering whatever they could find there. Herod soon returned and punished them for what they had done. He killed some of the rebels, and others had fled into fortified places. He besieged them there, killed them, and tore down their strongholds. When he had ended the rebellion in this way, he imposed a fine of 100 talents on the cities. Meanwhile Pacorus had fallen in battle, and the Parthians had been defeated. Then Titius sent Machaerus to help Herod, giving him 2 legions and 1,000 horsemen, while Antony urged Herod to hurry. But Machaerus, influenced by Antigonus and bribed with money, tried to inspect Antigonus's affairs without Herod's approval. Antigonus suspected why he had come, so he would not let him enter the city. Instead, he kept him at a distance by having stones thrown at him, and he made his own intentions clear. When Machaerus realized that Herod had advised him wisely, and that he himself had made a mistake by not listening, he withdrew to the city of Emmaus. In his anger over what he had suffered, he killed every Jew he met, whether enemy or friend. The king was provoked by his conduct and went to Samaria. He decided to go to Antony about these matters and tell him that he had no need of such helpers, who harmed him more than they harmed his enemies, and that he was able to defeat Antigonus by himself. But Machaerus followed him and begged him not to go to Antony, or if he was determined to go, to leave his brother Joseph with them, so that they could fight against Antigonus together. Because Machaerus pleaded so earnestly, Herod was reconciled to him. So he left Joseph there with his army, but charged him not to take any risks and not to quarrel with Machaerus. Herod himself hurried to Antony, who was then besieging Samosata, a place on the Euphrates. He brought both horsemen and foot soldiers as auxiliaries for him. When he came to Antioch, he found a large number of men gathered there who were very eager to go to Antony, but did not dare make the attempt because they feared the barbarians, who were attacking men on the road and had killed many. Herod encouraged them and became their guide for the journey. When they were within 2 days' march of Samosata, the barbarians had set an ambush to trouble those who were coming to Antony. In the places where the woods narrowed the passes leading to the plains, they placed a considerable number of horsemen, who were to remain still until the travelers had passed into the open ground. As soon as the front ranks had passed by, for Herod was bringing up the rear, about 500 men in ambush suddenly attacked them. They put the foremost men to flight, but the king came riding hard with the forces around him and immediately drove the enemy back. This gave courage to his own men and made them bold enough to continue, so that those who had run away before now returned, and the barbarians were killed on every side. The king kept killing them, recovered all the baggage, among which were many pack animals and slaves, and continued his march. Since many of the enemy were still in the woods near the passage that led into the plain, he attacked them too with a strong body of men, put them to flight, and killed many. In this way he made the roads safe for those who came afterward, and they called Herod their savior and protector. When Herod came near Samosata, Antony sent out his army in full equipment to meet him, both to show Herod this respect and because of the assistance Herod had given him. Antony had heard about the attacks the barbarians had made on him in Judea, and he was very glad to see him there after learning of the great deeds he had performed on the road. He received him very kindly, and could not help admiring his courage. As soon as Antony saw him, he embraced him, greeted him with the greatest affection, and gave him the place of honor, since he himself had recently made him king. Soon afterward Antiochus surrendered the fortress, and so that war came to an end. Antony then entrusted the rest to Sosius, ordered him to assist Herod, and went himself to Egypt. Accordingly, Sosius sent 2 legions ahead into Judea to help Herod, and he himself followed with the main body of the army. By this time Joseph had already been killed in Judea, in the following way. He forgot the instructions his brother Herod had given him when Herod went to Antony. After pitching his camp among the mountains, and after Machaerus had lent him 5 regiments, he hurried with them to Jericho to reap the grain belonging to that place. But the Roman regiments had only recently been raised and were inexperienced in war, since they had been gathered largely from Syria. The enemy attacked him and caught him in difficult terrain. Joseph himself was killed while fighting bravely, and the whole army was lost, for 6 regiments were slain. When Antigonus gained possession of the dead bodies, he cut off Joseph's head, even though Pharoras, Joseph's brother, would have redeemed it for 50 talents. After this defeat, the Galileans revolted from their commanders, seized those who belonged to Herod's party, and drowned them in the lake. Much of Judea also became rebellious. Machaerus, meanwhile, fortified the place called Gida in Samaria. At this time messengers came to Herod and told him what had happened. When he reached Daphne near Antioch, they told him of the misfortune that had overtaken his brother. Yet he had already expected it because of certain visions that had appeared to him in dreams, and had clearly foretold his brother's death. So he hastened his march. When he came to Mount Libanus, he received about 800 men from that region, and he already had 1 Roman legion with him. With these forces he came to Ptolemais. From there he marched by night with his army and went through Galilee. There the enemy met him and fought him, but they were defeated and shut up in the same stronghold from which they had sallied out the day before. Herod attacked the place in the morning, but because a great storm was then raging violently, he could accomplish nothing, and withdrew his army into the neighboring villages. As soon as the other legion Antony had sent him arrived to help, the men stationed in the stronghold became afraid and abandoned it during the night. Then the king marched quickly to Jericho, intending to avenge himself on the enemy for the slaughter of his brother. After he pitched his tents, he gave a feast for the principal commanders. When the meal was over and he had dismissed his guests, he withdrew to his own chamber. Here one may see how kindly God treated the king, for the upper part of the house collapsed when no one was in it, and therefore killed no one. Because Herod escaped so great and unexpected a danger, all the people believed that he was loved by God. The next day 6,000 of the enemy came down from the tops of the mountains to fight the Romans, which greatly terrified them. The light-armed soldiers came near and hurled darts and stones at the king's guards, who had come out, and one of them struck Herod in the side with a dart. Antigonus also sent a commander named Pappus with some forces against Samaria, wanting to show the enemy how powerful he was, and that he had men to spare in the war. Pappus sat down to oppose Machaerus. But Herod took 5 cities, seized those who remained in them, about 2,000 people, killed them, burned the cities themselves, and then returned to move against Pappus, who was encamped at a village called Asanus. Many men from Jericho and Judea, near which places he was, came running to join him. The enemy attacked his men with great boldness at that time and joined battle with them, but Herod defeated them in the fight. To avenge the slaughter of his brother, he pursued them fiercely and killed them as they fled. Since the houses were full of armed men, and many of them ran as far as the rooftops, he brought them under his control by pulling down the roofs. He saw the lower rooms packed with soldiers who were trapped and lying piled together. His men threw stones down on them as they lay heaped one on another, and killed them. There was no more dreadful sight in the whole war than this. Beyond the walls an immense multitude of dead men lay piled in heaps. This action especially broke the courage of the enemy, who now expected what would follow. A great number of people had come from distant places and were then around the village, but they now ran away. If the depth of winter had not held them back, the king's army, encouraged by this success, would have gone at once to Jerusalem, and the whole matter would have been finished immediately, for Antigonus was already looking for a way to flee and abandon the city. At that time, since it was late at night, the king ordered the soldiers to go to supper, while he went into a chamber to bathe because he was very tired. There he came into the greatest danger, though he escaped it by God's providence. He was naked, and had only one servant following him to attend him, while he bathed in an inner room. Some of the enemy, still in their armor, had fled there in fear and were then in the place. While Herod was bathing, the first of them came out with his naked sword drawn, and went out through the doors. A second followed him, and then a third, armed in the same way. They were so terrified that they did no harm to the king, and they thought they had done very well simply to get out of the house without being harmed themselves. The next day, however, Herod cut off the head of Pappus, who had already been killed, and sent it to Pharaoh as his punishment for what their brother had suffered through him, since Pappus was the man who had killed Joseph with his own hand. When the harshness of winter was over, Herod moved his army, came near Jerusalem, and pitched his camp close to the city. This was the 3rd year since he had been made king at Rome. As he moved his camp and came near the part of the wall that could most easily be attacked, he pitched the camp before the temple, intending to conduct his assaults in the same way Pompey had done. He surrounded the place with 3 bulwarks, erected towers, set a great many workers to the task, and cut down the trees around the city. After appointing suitable men to oversee the works, and while the army remained before the city, he himself went to Samaria to complete his marriage and take as his wife the daughter of Alexander, the son of Aristobulus, for he had already betrothed her, as I have related before. After the wedding was finished, Sosius came through Phoenicia. He had already sent his army ahead through the inland regions, and then he himself arrived as commander with a large force of cavalry and infantry. The king also came from Samaria, bringing with him a considerable army in addition to the forces already there, about 30,000 men in all. They all joined together at the walls of Jerusalem and camped by the north wall of the city. Their army now consisted of 11 legions of armed foot soldiers, 6,000 horsemen, and other auxiliary troops from Syria. There were 2 generals, Sosius, whom Antony had sent to help Herod, and Herod himself, who came on his own behalf to take the government away from Antigonus. Antigonus had been declared an enemy at Rome, and Herod intended to become king himself, according to the decree of the Senate. The Jews shut up inside the city walls fought against Herod with great energy and zeal, for the whole nation had gathered there. They spread many prophecies about the temple, and many other sayings pleasing to the people, as though God would rescue them from the dangers around them. They had also carried away everything outside the city, so that nothing would be left to feed either men or animals. By private raids they made the shortage of necessities even worse. When Herod learned this, he set ambushes in the best places to stop these private raids, and he sent legions of armed men to bring provisions from distant places. In a short time, therefore, his army had an abundant supply of food. 3 siege banks were easily raised, because so many hands were constantly working on them. It was summer, and nothing interfered with the work, either from the weather or from the laborers. So they brought their engines into position, battered the city walls, and tried every possible method of taking the place. Yet the people inside showed no fear. They also devised many engines to oppose the engines of the besiegers. They sallied out and burned not only the engines that were still unfinished, but also those that had already been completed. When they fought hand to hand, their attacks were no less daring than those of the Romans, though they were inferior in skill. Whenever their earlier works were destroyed, they built new ones, and when they dug mines underground, the two sides met each other there and fought beneath the earth. Relying more on fierce courage than on disciplined bravery, the Jews held out in the war to the very end. They did this while a mighty army surrounded them, and while they were suffering from famine and lack of necessities, for this happened to be a sabbatic year. The first men to scale the walls were 20 chosen soldiers. After them came Sosius' centurions. The first wall was taken in 40 days, and the second in 15 more. At that time some of the cloisters around the temple were burned. Herod claimed that Antigonus had burned them, in order to make him hated by the Jews. When the outer court of the temple and the lower city had been taken, the Jews fled into the inner court of the temple and into the upper city. Then, because they feared the Romans might prevent them from offering their daily sacrifices to God, they sent an embassy and asked only that they be allowed to bring in animals for sacrifice. Herod granted this, hoping they were preparing to surrender. But when he saw that they were doing nothing of the kind, and instead were fiercely resisting him in order to preserve the kingdom for Antigonus, he assaulted the city and took it by storm. Now, every part of the city was full of the dead. The Romans were enraged because the siege had lasted so long, and the Jews on Herod's side were so zealous that they were unwilling to leave even one of their opponents alive. People were continually killed in the narrow streets, in crowded houses, and as they fled toward the temple for shelter. No pity was shown to infants or to the aged, and not even the weaker sex was spared. Although the king sent messengers around begging the soldiers to spare the people, no one held back his hand from slaughter. As though they were mad, they fell on people of every age without distinction. Then Antigonus, paying no regard either to his former rank or to his present misfortune, came down from the citadel and fell at the feet of Sosius. Sosius felt no pity for him in the change of his fortune, but mocked him harshly and called him Antigon, as though he were a woman and not a man. Yet Sosius did not treat him like a woman by letting him go free. Instead, he put him in chains and kept him under close guard. After Herod had defeated his enemies, his next concern was to control the foreigners who had helped him. The crowd of strangers rushed to see the temple and the sacred things inside it. But the king thought victory would be a worse disaster than defeat if any of the things it was unlawful to see were seen by them. Therefore he used pleas, threats, and at times even forced to restrain them. He also stopped the plundering of the city. Many times he asked Sosius whether the Romans meant to empty the city of both money and men and leave him king over a desert. He told him that rule over the whole inhabited earth would be no compensation for the murder of his citizens. When Sosius said that the soldiers deserved to be allowed this plunder because of the siege they had endured, Herod answered that he would give every one of them a reward from his own money. In this way he redeemed what remained of the city from destruction. He did exactly what he had promised, giving a generous gift to every soldier, a proportionate gift to their commanders, and a truly royal gift to Sosius himself, until they all went away full of money. This destruction came upon the city of Jerusalem when Marcus Agrippa and Caninius Gallus were consuls at Rome, in the 185th Olympiad, in the 3rd month, on the day of the solemn fast. It was as if the cycle of calamities had returned to the same point as the disaster that had fallen on the Jews under Pompey, for the Jews had been captured by him on the same day, 7 years earlier. After Sosius dedicated a gold crown to God, he marched away from Jerusalem and carried Antigonus with him in chains to Antony. But Herod was afraid that Antony would merely keep Antigonus in prison, and that if Antigonus were taken by him to Rome, he might have his case heard by the Senate. Antigonus could argue that he himself was of royal blood, while Herod was only a private man, and that therefore the kingdom belonged at least to his sons because of their family, even if he himself had offended the Romans by what he had done. Because Herod feared this, he gave Antony a great deal of money, and tried to persuade him to have Antigonus killed. Once that was done, Herod would be free from this fear. And so the government of the Asamanians came to an end, 126 years after it had first been established. This family had been splendid and famous because of the nobility of their stock, the dignity of the high priesthood, and the glorious deeds their ancestors had performed for our nation. But these men lost the government through their quarrels with one another, and it passed to Herod, the son of Antipater, a man from no more than a common family, of no distinguished ancestry, and from a house that had been subject to other kings. This, history tells us, was the end of the Asamanian family.
And the book 14 ends with Herod master of Jerusalem and king of the Jews in fact as well as name, the last Hasmonean ruler dead, and the princess of that fallen house, Mariamne, at his side a marriage of love and politics that will end in tragedy. The Maccabean story is over and the age of Herod the Great has begun. His glittering, terrible reign, the building of the temple, and the murder of nearly everyone he loved is where book 15 begins. Thank you for sitting with the whole of Book 14, from the Brothers' War to the crowning of Herod. Mind the footnotes, and beware the folly. And before the lamp goes out, a small request. If something tonight taught you, or surprised you, or simply delighted you, do leave a comment and tell me what it was. And if there is a work, an author, or a tale you should like me to take up next, set it down there as well. I read every one, and many an episode has begun its life as a viewer's suggestion. Until next time.